Imagine standing on a hillside 900,000 years ago. The air is cool and thin. Below you, a valley stretches into shadow. There are no cities, no roads, no lights. Just the whisper of wind through ancient grass. You are looking at the world before everything changed. Somewhere beneath your feet, deep in the earth, a secret is buried. It is a secret written not in stone or bone, but in something far more intimate. It is written in your blood, in the spiraling code of your DNA, and it tells a story almost too terrifying to believe. Right now, in this modern age, nearly 8 billion people walk the earth. We fill every continent. We crowd into cities that glow like galaxies seen from space. Humanity seems unstoppable, infinite, overflowing with life and noise and ambition. But there was a time when all of that nearly ended. There was a moment, long before recorded history, when the entire human population collapsed. Not by half, not by 2/3, by 99%. Almost every human being alive on this planet vanished. Think about that for just a moment. Imagine your city, your town, your neighborhood. Now remove almost every single person. Leave only a handful. A few hundred, maybe 1,000, standing in the ruins of a species that was just a generation before, thriving. That is what happened to us, and for the longest time, nobody knew. The clue came not from archaeology, not from fossils carefully unearthed in some remote desert. It came from genetics, from the quiet, patient work of scientists studying the human genome, reading the ancient chapters written inside every living cell. What they found was a bottleneck. A genetic bottleneck so severe, so dramatic, that it rewrites everything we thought we knew about early human survival. Around 900,000 years ago, our ancestors were reduced to a breeding population of roughly 1,300 individuals. 1,300 people. That is all that stood between humanity and total extinction. Let that settle in your mind like a stone dropping into still water. For over 100,000 years, this tiny population clung to existence. Generation after generation, balanced on the edge of oblivion. One bad season, one terrible drought, one devastating disease, and we would have been erased from the story of life on Earth. You would not be here. I would not be here. None of this would exist. And yet here we are. How? Why did it happen? What force was powerful enough to destroy nearly all of early humanity? And how did that fragile remnant survive long enough to eventually become us? These are the questions that have haunted researchers since the discovery was published. These are the questions that do not yet have clean, comfortable answers. The evidence is real. The debate is fierce. And the mystery is deeper than most people realize. Because here is the part that makes this story truly strange. The bottleneck does not match what we see in the fossil record. The geological evidence from that period does not show a single obvious catastrophe. There is no giant asteroid impact at 900,000 years ago. No supervolcano eruption neatly dated to that exact window. Something happened. But the Earth itself seems reluctant to confess. It is as if the planet swallowed the evidence whole. Some scientists believe it was climate. A devastating series of ice ages that stripped the landscape bare and drove early humans into shrinking pockets of habitable land. Others suspect disease or competition with other species, or some combination we have not yet imagined. And some researchers question whether the bottleneck happened at all. That is what makes this documentary different. We are not here to give you a simple answer tied up with a neat little bow. We are here to walk through the evidence together, to examine what we know, what we suspect, and what still hides in shadow. Tonight, we travel back 900,000 years. We will stand in the world our ancestors knew. We will feel the cold they felt. We will look into the darkness that nearly swallowed our entire species. And we will follow the trail of clues that scientists are still piecing together today. We will explore the genetic evidence and what it truly reveals. We will examine the climate records locked inside ocean sediment and ancient ice. We will consider the fossil gaps and the strange silences in the archaeological record. We will meet the researchers who made this discovery and hear why some of their colleagues disagree. We will look at what this bottleneck might mean for how we understand human evolution itself. And we will ask the question that lingers beneath everything. If 99% of humanity vanished once before in the deep past, with almost no warning and almost no trace, could it happen again? That question is not meant to frighten you. It is meant to humble you. Because the story of human survival is not the triumphant march we often imagine. It is fragile. It is unlikely. And it is filled with chapters we are only now beginning to read. So, settle in. Let the world grow quiet around you. Tonight, we go into the gap that science still cannot fully explain. Tonight, we explore the longest, darkest night in human history. And we discover how a handful of survivors, against all odds, carried the spark of our species through 100,000 years of shadow. This is the story of life 900,000 years ago. This is the story of when 99% of humans vanished. And this is the story of why you exist at all. Let us begin. Chapter 2. Why this matters more than you think. Before we travel back in time, we need to understand why this discovery shook the scientific world. We need to grasp the stakes. Because this is not simply an academic curiosity buried in a genetics journal. This changes the way we see ourselves as a species. Let us start with a number. 1,300. That is the estimated effective breeding population that survived the bottleneck. Not 1,300 total people. 1,300 individuals capable of reproducing and passing their genes to the next generation. The actual number of living humans may have been slightly higher. Perhaps a few thousand in total, when you include the elderly, the very young, and those who could not or did not reproduce. But the genetic signature points to roughly 1,300 breeding adults. To put that in perspective, there are more people in a single small town today than there were humans on the entire planet during this bottleneck. More people attend an average concert. More people work in a single large office building. That is how close we came to disappearing. Now, you might wonder why this matters today. After all, it happened almost 1 million years ago. We survived. We recovered. We eventually spread across every continent and built civilizations. Why should we care about something so distant? The answer lies in what the bottleneck did to us. When a population crashes that severely, something profound happens to its genetic diversity. Think of it like this. Imagine a library containing millions of unique books. Each book is different, filled with its own particular stories and information. Now imagine a fire sweeps through that library and destroys almost everything. Only a small shelf of books survives. Those surviving books are all that remain. Every future copy, every future edition will be based on that tiny surviving collection. That is what happened to the human genome. The genetic diversity of our entire species was funneled through an impossibly narrow passage. Vast amounts of variation were lost forever. Traits, adaptations, immune responses, all the biological richness that millions of individuals had carried was reduced to what those few survivors held within them. And we still carry the scars of that loss today. Modern humans are, genetically speaking, remarkably similar to one another, more similar than many other species, more similar than chimpanzees, more similar than many populations of mice or fruit flies. This has puzzled geneticists for decades. The bottleneck may be the answer. If this discovery holds, it means that every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, descends from that tiny group of survivors. Every culture, every civilization, every language, every face you have ever seen traces back to perhaps 1,300 people who refused to die. That is staggering. And it is deeply personal, because it means the diversity we celebrate the differences between peoples and nations and traditions, all of it bloomed from an almost impossibly small seed. We are, in the deepest biological sense, one family, closer than we ever imagined. But there is a darker implication as well. Limited genetic diversity makes a species vulnerable. It means there are fewer defenses against new diseases, fewer variations that might prove useful when the environment shifts. A genetically narrow species is a species living on borrowed time, even if it does not know it. Some researchers believe this ancient bottleneck left fingerprints on human health that persist to this day. Certain genetic diseases, certain vulnerabilities, certain patterns in how our immune systems respond, these may trace back to that catastrophic population crash. We are still paying the price for what happened 900,000 years ago. And then there is the evolutionary question. The bottleneck occurred during a critical period in human evolution. Around 900,000 years ago, our ancestors were not yet Homo sapiens. They were earlier members of the genus Homo, likely Homo heidelbergensis, or a closely related species. This was a time of transition. Brain sizes were increasing. Tool technologies were advancing. Early humans were spreading into new environments, adapting to new challenges. Evolution was actively sculpting the lineage that would eventually produce us. What happens when you take that evolving population and crush it down to 1,000 individuals? You get rapid change. In a small population, genetic drift becomes powerful. Random changes in gene frequency that would be insignificant in a large population suddenly become dominant. Mutations that might otherwise take hundreds of thousands of years to spread can become fixed in just a few generations. Some scientists have proposed that the bottleneck itself may have accelerated human evolution, that the very catastrophe which nearly destroyed us also reshaped us, pushed us in new directions, perhaps even contributed to the emergence of traits we now consider distinctly human. This is speculative, and we will explore it carefully. But the possibility is breathtaking. It suggests that humanity as we know it may be the product not of slow, steady progress, but of crisis, that we were forged in a furnace, that the thing which almost killed us also made us who we are. Now consider what this means for our understanding of history. We tend to think of human history as beginning with the first civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley. Perhaps we stretch it back further to the cave paintings of Lascaux 40,000 years ago, or to the first stone tools roughly 3 million years ago. But this bottleneck tells us that the most dramatic chapter in human history has no written record. No paintings, no monuments. It left almost nothing we can touch or see. Only a ghost signal in our DNA, waiting hundreds of thousands of years for someone clever enough to read it. And it tells us something humbling. We almost were not here. The odds were stacked against us. For 100,000 years, the survival of our entire lineage depended on a group small enough to fit inside a single building. Every day was a dice roll. Every generation was a miracle. If you have ever felt that human life is fragile, that civilization is more delicate than it appears, this discovery confirms your instinct in the most visceral way possible. We are here by the thinnest of margins. And that should change how we think about everything. About our past, our present, and our future. About how we treat each other and the planet we live on. About how seriously we take the threats that could, once again, push our species to the brink. This is not just ancient history. This is a warning written in our own blood. So with those stakes in mind, let us go back. Let us return to the world as it was before the crisis struck. Let us see what life looked like for our ancestors in the time leading up to the bottleneck. Let us understand the world they inhabited, the challenges they faced, and the forces that were quietly gathering to nearly erase them from existence. The answers are waiting, buried in stone and sediment and ice, and in the invisible architecture of every cell in your body. Chapter 3. The World Before the Vanishing. Close your eyes for a moment and let the modern world dissolve. Let the hum of electricity fade. Let the cities crumble softly back into soil. Let the highways and airports and satellites disappear like morning fog. Now open your eyes to a world almost unrecognizable. 900,000 years ago, the Earth was a planet in flux. The continents were roughly where they are today, but the climate was different, dramatically different. The planet was locked in a cycle of ice ages and warm periods that had been repeating for millions of years. These cycles were driven by subtle shifts in Earth's orbit around the Sun. Small wobbles in the planet's tilt and rotation changed how much sunlight reached different parts of the surface. These changes were tiny, almost imperceptible. But over thousands of years, they transformed the world. During cold phases, massive ice sheets advanced from the poles. They swallowed northern Europe, much of North America, and vast stretches of Asia. Sea levels dropped dramatically as water was locked up in glaciers miles thick. During warm phases, the ice retreated. Forests expanded. Coastlines shifted. Animals and early humans moved into newly opened territories, only to be pushed back again when the cold returned. This was the rhythm of the planet. Advance and retreat, warmth and cold, life expanding, then contracting. And around 900,000 years ago, this rhythm was intensifying. Something was changing in the pattern of ice ages. Scientists call it the Mid-Pleistocene transition. Before this period, ice age cycles occurred roughly every 40,000 years. Afterward, they shifted to a longer, more severe cycle of roughly 100,000 years. The cold periods became colder. The ice sheets grew larger. The warm intervals between them grew shorter and more unpredictable. The planet was entering a new and more dangerous phase of climate instability. This is the world our ancestors inhabited. They were not Homo sapiens. Our species would not emerge for another several 100,000 years. The humans alive 900,000 years ago were earlier members of our lineage, most likely belonging to or closely related to Homo heidelbergensis. These were not primitive creatures. They walked upright. They had large brains, though not quite as large as ours. They made stone tools, sophisticated ones, using techniques that required planning and skill. They almost certainly lived in social groups and cooperated to survive. Evidence suggests they hunted large game. They controlled fire, or at least were learning to. They inhabited a range of environments across Africa, Europe, and Asia. They were adaptable and resilient, but they were also vulnerable. Their populations were never enormous by modern standards. Early human groups were small, scattered, and separated by vast distances. Communication between groups was limited or non-existent. Each band of perhaps a few dozen individuals lived or died based on local conditions. When the environment was favorable, populations grew and spread. When conditions deteriorated, they shrank and retreated to refugia, small pockets of habitable land where food and water could still be found. This pattern of expansion and contraction was the heartbeat of early human existence. Now imagine the climate shifting into a harsher mode. Imagine the winters growing longer, the grasslands shrinking, the herds of large animals that your people depend on migrating further away or dying off entirely. Imagine the rivers drying to trickles and the forests retreating up mountain slopes. Imagine watching season after season as the world slowly becomes less generous. This is what the geological record suggests was happening during the period leading up to the bottleneck. The Mid-Pleistocene transition was making life progressively harder for species that depended on stable, predictable environments. And early humans, for all their cleverness, depended on their environments more than we might like to admit. They did not have agriculture. They could not store surplus food for lean years. They did not have the technology to build shelters strong enough to endure the worst conditions. They were hunter-gatherers, intimately tied to the rhythms of the natural world. When those rhythms faltered, they had nowhere to hide. Africa, where most scientists believe our lineage was centered during this period, was not immune to these changes. While northern continents bore the brunt of the ice sheets, Africa experienced dramatic shifts in rainfall patterns. Vast regions that had been green and fertile turned to desert. The Sahara expanded and contracted like a breathing organism. Forests fragmented into isolated patches. Lakes dried up and reappeared over millennia. The landscape was in constant slow-motion upheaval. For the humans living through this, it would not have felt like a sudden catastrophe. It would have felt like a slow tightening. Each generation inheriting a world slightly more difficult than the one before, slightly fewer resources, slightly more competition, slightly less margin for error. This is the context we need to hold in our minds. The bottleneck did not happen in a vacuum. It happened against a backdrop of profound environmental change, a planet shifting into a more extreme climate regime, a world growing harsher for the very species that would one day claim to dominate it. But here is where the mystery deepens. Climate change alone may not be enough to explain what happened. Other species survived this same period without experiencing such a catastrophic population crash. Other large mammals, other primates, weathered the Mid-Pleistocene transition without being reduced to 1,000 individuals. So why us? What made early humans so uniquely vulnerable? Or was there something else happening, something beyond climate, that we have not yet identified? These questions hover over the evidence like a fog that will not lift. And they lead us directly to the next chapter in this story, where we examine the actual evidence that first revealed this ancient catastrophe. Because none of this would be known at all if it were not for a remarkable study published in the year 2023 that read the story of near extinction hidden inside the genes of living people. The clues were always there, inside you, inside me, inside every person who has ever lived in the last 900,000 years, waiting patiently to be decoded. And when they finally were, the story they told was almost too dramatic to believe. Chapter 4. The Ghost Signal in Our Genes. The discovery did not come from a dig site or a dusty archive. It came from a laboratory. From rows of humming computers analyzing the deepest structures of human DNA. And it arrived with the force of a quiet earthquake, the kind that rattles everything without making a sound. In 2023, a team of researchers led by scientists in China and Italy published a study that sent ripples through the fields of genetics and paleoanthropology. Their paper appeared in the journal Science, one of the most prestigious scientific publications in the world. The title was technical. The implications were not. Using a new analytical method they had developed over more than a decade, the team examined the genomes of over 3,000 living people from diverse populations across Africa, Europe, Asia, and beyond. They were not looking for individual genes or specific traits. They were looking at something more fundamental. They were reading the deep history encoded in the patterns of genetic variation across the entire human genome. Their method was called FitCoal, which stands for Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent. The name is complex, but the idea behind it is elegant. It traces the lineages of genes backward through time, like following the branches of an enormous family tree deeper and deeper into the past. By analyzing how genetic lineages converge and diverge, FitCoal can estimate how large the human population was at different points in history. It is like reading tree rings, except the tree is made of DNA and its rings span hundreds of thousands of years. And what the researchers found was a chasm. The data showed that approximately 930,000 years ago, the ancestral human population experienced a catastrophic decline. The effective breeding population, the number of individuals actually contributing genes to the next generation, crashed to roughly 1,280, from a population that had likely numbered in the tens of thousands or more, a loss of approximately 98.7%. And this was not a brief crisis. The bottleneck persisted for approximately 117,000 years. Over 100 millennia of existence on the razor's edge, where the total breeding population of the species that would become humanity hovered around 1,000 individuals. To put the duration in perspective, all of recorded human history, every empire, every war, every invention, every poem ever written, spans roughly 5,000 years. The bottleneck lasted more than 20 times that long. For over 100,000 years, humanity was a whisper. The researchers named this event the ancient severe population bottleneck, and they argued that it left permanent marks on the human genome. Specifically, they proposed that it caused the loss of approximately 65.8% of genetic diversity that had existed in the population before the crash. That is an astonishing figure. Nearly 2/3 of all human genetic variation erased in a single prolonged catastrophe. The team also suggested that this bottleneck might explain a long-standing puzzle in paleoanthropology. There is a notable gap in the African fossil record between roughly 900,000 and 600,000 years ago. Fossils from this period are extremely rare. If the human population really was that small for that long, the scarcity of fossils makes sense. Fewer people means fewer remains. Fewer remains means fewer fossils to find millions of years later. The silence in the fossil record might not be an accident of preservation. It might be real. The study also proposed a tantalizing evolutionary possibility. The bottleneck period coincides roughly with the time when two ancestral human chromosomes are believed to have fused to form modern human chromosome 2. This fusion is one of the key genetic differences between humans and other great apes. Could the bottleneck have facilitated this chromosomal change? In a very small population, genetic novelties can spread much more quickly than in a large one. A chromosomal fusion that would normally be eliminated by natural selection might persist and become fixed if the population is tiny enough. The researchers speculated that the bottleneck might have been a crucible of speciation. The very event that nearly destroyed our ancestors may have been the pressure that forged a new species, perhaps even contributing to the eventual emergence of Homo sapiens. It is a beautiful and terrifying idea. But not everyone was convinced. Almost immediately, the study drew criticism from other geneticists and paleoanthropologists. The objections were serious and came from respected researchers who had spent decades studying human population history. Some questioned the FitCoal method itself. They argued that estimating population sizes from genetic data over such deep timescales is extraordinarily difficult. Small errors in assumptions can produce dramatically different results. The method was new and had not yet been independently replicated. Others pointed out that the study assumed a single ancestral population. But growing evidence suggests that early human evolution involved multiple populations spread across Africa, interacting and exchanging genes in complex ways. A bottleneck in one group might not reflect the experience of all. Some critics argued that the signal detected by FitCoal could be explained by population structure rather than a true bottleneck. If the ancestral population was divided into small, partially isolated groups, the genetic signal could mimic a bottleneck without the population ever actually crashing to such low numbers. This is a crucial distinction. A fragmented population of 10,000 individuals living in isolated bands of a few hundred each might produce a similar genetic signature to a single population of 1,300. The math can look the same, even though the reality is profoundly different. Other researchers noted that evidence from other species does not support a global catastrophe severe enough to reduce humans to such tiny numbers. If the cause was climate, why were other African mammals not similarly devastated? The debate grew heated. Papers were published challenging the findings. Responses were issued defending them. Conferences buzzed with arguments and counterarguments. And in the middle of it all, one question remained stubbornly unanswered. If the bottleneck was real, what caused it? The study itself did not definitively identify the trigger. Climate change during the Mid-Pleistocene transition was suggested as a likely factor, But the researchers acknowledged that the evidence was circumstantial. No smoking gun had been found. A catastrophe severe enough to destroy 99% of a species should leave marks in the rocks, in the ice cores, in the fossil record. Somewhere, there should be a scar on the face of the Earth that says, here is where it happened. Here is what did it. But that scar has not been clearly identified. The climate was changing, yes. The ice ages were intensifying. Africa was drying in cycles. But these processes were gradual, spanning tens of thousands of years. Could a slow climatic shift really produce such a sudden and devastating population crash? Or was there something else? Something faster? Something more violent? Something that has been erased by time or overlooked by science? Some have whispered about supervolcanic eruptions yet to be precisely dated. Others have wondered about pandemic diseases lost to the deep past. A few have even speculated about catastrophic competition with other hominin species. The truth is, we do not yet know. And that is what makes this story so compelling and so unsettling. We have the evidence that something terrible happened. We can see its shadow in our own DNA, but the cause remains hidden, like a face glimpsed through fog that vanishes when you try to look directly at it. Somewhere in the deep past, something brought humanity to its knees. And the survivors, that tiny band of perhaps 1,000 souls, carried the future of our entire species in their hands without ever knowing it. What were their lives like? How did they endure? What did they lose? And what did they gain during those long, dark millennia? The answers lie deeper in the evidence, in layers we have only begun to excavate. And what waits there may force us to rethink not just when modern humanity began, but why it began at all. Because there is another piece of this puzzle that the original study only hinted at. A piece that connects the bottleneck not just to our genes, but to the very structure of the human brain. And when you see that connection, everything about this story changes. That is where we go next. Chapter 5. Contradictions and Anomalies. The bottleneck study landed like a grenade in the world of paleoanthropology, not because it was wrong, because it was inconvenient. It challenged decades of carefully constructed narratives about human evolution being slow, gradual, and predictable. Science does not like surprises. Scientists especially do not like surprises that rewrite textbooks. And yet, here was a claim, published in one of the most prestigious journals on Earth, asserting that our ancestors nearly vanished entirely. The first contradiction emerged almost immediately. If only 1,280 breeding individuals survived for over 100,000 years, how did they survive at all? Population genetics tells us that groups this small are extraordinarily vulnerable to inbreeding depression, stochastic extinction, and disease. Consider this carefully. A population of 1,280 is smaller than many modern high schools. It is smaller than most rural villages. Genetic models suggest that populations below a few thousand individuals face what biologists call an extinction vortex. Escape from that vortex is statistically improbable. Yet here we are, 7 billion descendants of that tiny trembling band. The math does not add up unless something extraordinary happened during those 117,000 years. Something that shielded this group or granted them advantages we have not yet identified. The second contradiction is geographic. The study analyzed genomes from populations across the globe. African, European, Asian, Indigenous American, and Oceanian lineages all carry the bottleneck signal. Every single one. That implies a single ancestral population, isolated and small, gave rise to all modern humans. But other genetic studies suggest early human populations were structured across Africa. Multiple groups in different regions, loosely connected by occasional gene flow. These two pictures do not easily reconcile. One says unity. The other says fragmentation. Both claim the evidence supports them. Critics pointed to this tension immediately. If ancient populations were spread across the African continent in semi-isolated groups, the FitCoal signal might be detecting reduced gene flow between groups rather than an actual crash in total numbers. Imagine 5 villages of 500 people each, separated by expanding deserts. Individually, they are stable, but genetically, they look isolated. To a coalescent model reading the data millions of years later, that fragmentation might mimic a bottleneck. The signal could be structural, not numerical. The research team anticipated this objection. They ran simulations showing that population structure alone could not replicate the specific pattern FitCoal detected. The loss of genetic diversity was too severe, too synchronized, too complete to be explained by mere geographic separation. But not everyone was convinced. Some geneticists argued that FitCoal, despite its sophistication, was being asked to resolve events at the extreme edge of its temporal resolution. 900,000 years is an enormous distance to peer through the fog of mutation and recombination. Here is where the contradiction deepens. The fossil record from this exact period is almost completely empty. Between roughly 900,000 and 600,000 years ago, African hominin fossils are vanishingly rare. This silence has been noted for decades, long before the bottleneck study existed. Some researchers had attributed the fossil gap to preservation bias. Africa's acidic soils and tropical climates destroy bone. Tectonic activity buries sites beyond reach. Funding for African paleoanthropology has historically lagged behind European and Asian excavations. The absence of fossils, they argued, means nothing definitive. But the bottleneck study reframes that silence. What if fossils are absent because there were almost no individuals alive to leave them? What if the fossil gap is not an artifact of geology, but a genuine record of near extinction? This is an unsettling possibility. It means the emptiness in the earth is real. The ground is not hiding our ancestors. It is telling us the truth. There were almost none of them left to find. Another anomaly concerns the brain. Paleoanthropologists have long noted that brain size in the human lineage increased dramatically during and after this exact period. Before 900,000 years ago, hominin brain volumes averaged around 900 cubic centimeters. After the bottleneck, they surged toward 1,200 and beyond. The timing is suspicious. If the bottleneck created intense selective pressure, favoring individuals with greater cognitive flexibility, problem-solving ability, and social intelligence, then the crisis itself may have been the engine of encephalization. Survival demanded bigger brains, and only those who had them passed on their genes. This is not established consensus. It is a hypothesis that the study's authors carefully suggested. But the correlation is striking. The worst crisis in human prehistory aligns precisely with the most dramatic expansion of the human brain. Coincidence is possible, but coincidence at this scale demands scrutiny. There is another anomaly that rarely gets discussed. During this same window, the archaeological record shows a marked shift in stone tool technology. The Acheulean hand axe tradition, stable for hundreds of thousands of years, begins to show regional variation and increased complexity right around the end of the bottleneck. Tools do not evolve on their own. Minds evolve and tools follow. If the bottleneck forced rapid cognitive evolution, then the archaeological record should show exactly what it shows. A long period of stasis, followed by sudden innovation. The pattern fits the prediction almost too neatly. And there is one more contradiction that keeps researchers awake. The study suggests the bottleneck may have driven speciation itself, that the tiny population which survived was not yet Homo sapiens when the crisis began, but became Homo sapiens because of it. If true, this means our species was not born from success. It was born from catastrophe. We are not the culmination of a long, triumphant march. We are the survivors of a disaster so total that it nearly ended our story before it began. That reframing is not merely scientific. It is philosophical. and it is one the evidence increasingly supports. But before we accept that narrative, we must look further, because the ancient world holds stories about this kind of catastrophe. Stories told by people who could not possibly have known the science. Stories that describe, with eerie precision, a time when humanity almost disappeared from the earth. Chapter 6. Myths and out-of-place evidence. Every civilization on Earth tells a story about near extinction. Every single one. The flood narratives alone span Mesopotamia, India, China, Greece, Mesoamerica, West Africa, Aboriginal Australia, and dozens of indigenous traditions across North America. The universality is staggering and demands explanation. The standard interpretation is straightforward. Ancient peoples experienced local floods, rivers overflowed, coastlines shifted. These traumatic events became mythologized, exaggerated, passed through generations until they became cosmic. The flood was not global. The memory was simply persistent and universal because floods happen everywhere. That explanation is reasonable. It is probably correct for most flood myths. But it does not account for the specific recurring elements that appear across cultures with no known contact. Elements that describe not just water, but a bottleneck, a remnant, a chosen few who restart humanity. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim survives with his family and selected animals. In Genesis, Noah preserves a remnant of life. In the Hindu Matsya Purana, Manu is saved to repopulate the world. In the Popol Vuh, the gods destroy and remake humanity multiple times before succeeding. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Humanity grows. Humanity is judged insufficient or flawed. A catastrophe reduces the population to almost nothing. The survivors carry forward something essential. They become the seed of a new and better version of humankind. This is not merely a flood story. It is a bottleneck story. Now, no serious scientist claims that myths from 5,000 years ago directly remember events from 900,000 years ago. Oral traditions do not survive that long intact. The temporal gap is far too vast. The connection, if it exists, must be indirect, structural, and psychological rather than literal. But consider the possibility that bottleneck events happen more than once. Consider that the pattern of near extinction and recovery repeated itself throughout human and hominin prehistory. If that is true, then the mythic template of destruction and renewal might reflect a recurring lived experience rather than a single memory. The Toba supervolcanic eruption, approximately 74,000 years ago, may have caused another severe population reduction. Some researchers estimate the human population dropped to fewer than 10,000 individuals after Toba blanketed South and Southeast Asia in ash and triggered a volcanic winter lasting years. If both the 930,000-year bottleneck and the Toba event actually occurred, then our lineage survived at least two near-extinction crises. The mythic insistence that humanity was almost destroyed and then reborn is not fantasy. It is pattern recognition encoded in narrative form across millennia. There is something else. Several mythic traditions describe the survivors as fundamentally changed. The post-flood humans are smarter, more aware, more capable. In some traditions, they receive language. In others, they receive fire, agriculture, or law. The catastrophe does not merely reduce them. It transforms them. This maps onto the scientific hypothesis with uncomfortable precision. If the 930,000-year bottleneck drove the evolution of larger brains and more complex cognition, then the survivors literally were transformed. They emerged from the crucible as a different kind of being. The myths say the same thing in symbolic language. Let us turn to the out-of-place evidence. Across Africa, there are archaeological sites that do not fit the standard timeline cleanly. Stone tools of unexpected sophistication appear in layers dated to the bottleneck period or shortly after. They suggest cognitive leaps that the gradual model struggles to explain. At Kathupan in South Africa, Stone-tipped spears have been dated to approximately 500,000 years ago. That is significantly earlier than the traditional timeline for hafted weapon technology. These weapons require planning, adhesive preparation, and multi-step construction. They require the kind of mind that the bottleneck may have produced. At Olorgesailie in Kenya, the archaeological record shows a dramatic transition. For hundreds of thousands of years, the site contained simple Acheulean hand axes. Then, in layers corresponding to a period of intense environmental upheaval, the technology shifts abruptly to smaller, more sophisticated Middle Stone Age tools and pigment use. The Olorgesailie transition has been linked to environmental instability. But environmental instability is exactly what the bottleneck study describes: expanding deserts, collapsing ecosystems. The Mid-Pleistocene transition, reshaping Africa's climate from the ground up. The archaeological shift and the genetic bottleneck may be recording the same event from different angles. There is also the puzzle of symbolic behavior. Ochre use, sometimes cited as evidence of symbolic or ritualistic thinking, appears in the African record earlier than many models predict. If cognitive complexity surged during or immediately after the bottleneck, early symbolic behavior becomes less anomalous and more expected. None of this constitutes proof. Archaeology cannot yet directly confirm the population bottleneck. The tools and ochre and weapons are suggestive, not conclusive. But the convergence of evidence from genetics, paleontology, archaeology, and even mythology creates a pattern that is increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. There is one more piece of out-of-place evidence that deserves attention: human chromosome 2. Modern humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Every other great ape has 24. At some point in our lineage, 2 ancestral chromosomes fused into one. The fusion is clearly visible in the genetic sequence. The timing of that fusion event is not precisely known, but estimates place it somewhere between 900,000 and 700,000 years ago, directly within the bottleneck window. A chromosomal fusion in a large population would be unlikely to spread. It would be diluted by interbreeding with individuals carrying the unfused version. But in a population of 1,280 individuals, genetic drift is enormously powerful. A chromosomal rearrangement that would vanish in a large population could fix rapidly in a tiny one. The bottleneck may have been the mechanism by which this defining feature of our genome became universal. If that is true, then the bottleneck did not merely threaten our ancestors. It literally restructured their genome. It made them something new, something that could no longer interbreed freely with the parent population, something that was, for the first time, on the road to becoming us. The myths say the survivors were transformed. The chromosomes say the same thing. And now the question is no longer whether the bottleneck happened. The question is what it created. Because what emerged from those 117,000 years of near extinction was not just a surviving population. It was a new species. And that species was about to inherit the Earth. But inheriting the Earth would require something more than bigger brains and fused chromosomes. It would require a kind of resilience that no other hominin lineage possessed. And the evidence for that resilience leads us to the most disturbing implication of the entire study. Chapter 7. Stakes Escalation. Let us be precise about what is at stake. If the bottleneck hypothesis is correct in its strongest form, then the human species exists because of a catastrophe that killed approximately 98.7% of our ancestral population. We are the descendants of the 1.3% who refuse to disappear. That number is not metaphorical. The study estimates the pre-bottleneck population was roughly 98,000 effective individuals. It crashed to approximately 1,280. Run the arithmetic. The survival rate is vanishingly small. Almost everyone died. Almost every lineage ended. Almost every genetic variant, every behavioral adaptation, every accumulated innovation was lost. We talk casually about extinction events, the dinosaurs. The Permian die-off. We frame them as ancient, remote, dramatic, but ultimately disconnected from us. The bottleneck study says that framing is wrong. It says the most relevant extinction event in human history happened to us, to our direct ancestors. And it almost succeeded. Now consider what 117,000 years actually means. It is not a brief crisis. It is not a bad century or a terrible millennium. 117,000 years is longer than the entire existence of Homo sapiens as a recognized species. Our ancestors survived at the edge of extinction for longer than we have existed. During that time, every generation faced the same calculus. Find food in a collapsing ecosystem. Find mates in a population smaller than a village. Avoid disease without medical knowledge. Raise children to adulthood in a world that was actively trying to erase their kind from the biological record. Generation after generation. For roughly 5,000 generations. Each one a coin flip between survival and oblivion. The selective pressure must have been extraordinary. In population genetics, small populations experience intense genetic drift, where random chance determines which traits survive. But they also experience intense natural selection when environmental pressures are severe. Both forces were operating simultaneously during the bottleneck. This is the crucible the study describes. Not a metaphorical crucible. A literal evolutionary forge where every weakness was punished and every advantage was amplified across thousands of generations. The individuals who emerged from the other side of this process were not the same as those who entered it. Their brains were larger. Their social structures were likely more complex. Their ability to cooperate, plan, communicate, and innovate had been sharpened by over 100 millennia of relentless pressure. They were, in every meaningful sense, a new kind of animal. But here is where the stakes escalate beyond biology. If the bottleneck drove speciation, if it created Homo sapiens or the immediate precursor to Homo sapiens, then our species' identity is inseparable from catastrophe. We are not a species that experienced a disaster. We are a species that was forged by one. The disaster is not something that happened to us. It is us. This has implications that extend far beyond academic debate. It means that the qualities we consider most essentially human, our creativity, our adaptability, our relentless drive to survive and expand and transform our environment, may be direct products of nearly going extinct. The paintings on the walls of Lascaux, the mathematics that sent us to the moon, the languages we speak, the societies we build, all of it may trace back to the specific selective pressures imposed by 117,000 years of survival at the absolute minimum viable population size. And that raises a question that scientists are only beginning to ask. If catastrophe made us what we are, what does that say about our future? Are we hardwired for crisis? Do we function best when existence itself is threatened? Is the restlessness that defines our species a scar from the bottleneck that never fully healed? These are not idle philosophical musings. They have practical consequences, because the bottleneck study does not merely tell us about the past. It tells us about our genetic architecture right now. The 65.8% of genetic diversity that was lost during the bottleneck is still lost. It was never recovered. Every human alive today carries a genome shaped by that ancient catastrophe. Our limited genetic diversity compared to other great apes, a fact that has puzzled geneticists for decades, now has a proposed explanation. We are genetically impoverished because we almost did not make it. The bottleneck wrote itself into our DNA permanently. This matters for medicine. It matters for understanding disease susceptibility, immune response variation, and the genetic underpinnings of conditions that disproportionately affect humans. Our vulnerability to certain cancers, autoimmune disorders, and neurological conditions may partly reflect the genetic diversity we lost 900,000 years ago. The bottleneck is not history. It is present tense. It is living in your cells right now. And there is a deeper implication still. The study suggests that during the bottleneck, two ancestral chromosomes fused to form chromosome 2. If that fusion event contributed to reproductive isolation, to the inability to interbreed with the parent population, then the bottleneck was the speciation event itself. This means that roughly 900,000 years ago, a small group of hominins became genetically distinct from their relatives. They could no longer fully merge back into the broader population. They were alone. A new lineage, untested, fragile, carrying a reorganized genome in a world that had nearly destroyed them. Everything that followed, every migration, every innovation, every civilization, every war, every poem, every child born for the next 900 millennia, descends from that moment of isolation. From that vanishing point where nearly everything was lost and something entirely new began. The other hominin lineages did not survive. Homo heidelbergensis disappeared. Homo erectus eventually disappeared. The Neanderthals would appear and disappear. The Denisovans would appear and disappear. Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, Homo luzonensis, all gone. Only one lineage persisted. Only one navigated every catastrophe, every climate shift, every extinction pressure, and emerged dominant. The lineage that was forged in the bottleneck. We carry their scars. We carry their adaptations. We carry the genome they rebuilt from nearly nothing. And we carry, perhaps most importantly, the question that their survival poses to every generation that follows. Can we do it again? Because the bottleneck study does not just illuminate the past. It illuminates a pattern suggesting that our lineage has been defined by its relationship to catastrophe since before our species had a name. And patterns, once established, have a tendency to repeat. The climate is changing again. The pressures are mounting again. The question of whether humanity can survive what is coming is not abstract. It is the same question our ancestors faced 900,000 years ago, standing on a continent that was trying to kill them, watching their numbers fall toward a threshold from which recovery should have been impossible. They answered that question with survival, with adaptation, with the evolution of minds capable of painting cave walls and splitting atoms and reading these words right now. But there's something the bottleneck study revealed that almost nobody has discussed publicly. Something hidden in the genetic data that the research team flagged quietly in their supplementary materials. Something about what happened at the exact moment the population began to recover. The recovery was not gradual. It was explosive. After 117,000 years of near stasis at 1,280 individuals, the population surged. The growth curve goes nearly vertical. Something changed. Something unlocked. And when you look at what changed, when you examine the genetic signatures of that explosive recovery, you find evidence of something that should not be possible. A coordinated suite of genetic changes affecting brain development, immune function, and social cognition, appearing almost simultaneously in the genomic record, as if the bottleneck was not merely survived, as if it was solved. What solved it? What could have triggered such rapid coordinated change at the exact moment of recovery? The answer lies in the most controversial implication of the entire study, one that the authors hinted at, but did not fully explore. The answer lies in what those 1,280 individuals learned to do that no hominin had ever done before. And that changes everything we thought we knew about what it means to be human. Chapter 8. The fight over what really happened. We left you standing at the edge of a question. The 1,280 survivors did something unprecedented. Their brains reorganized. Their chromosomes fused. Their genetic architecture shifted in ways that should have taken millions of years. But before we reveal what they learned, we need to be honest. Not everyone agrees this bottleneck even happened. Science does not progress by consensus. It advances through argument, through friction, through the uncomfortable collision of competing ideas. And the 2023 bottleneck paper landed like a grenade in a field already riddled with disputes. Three major counter-theories emerged almost immediately. Each one demands serious consideration. The first competing theory is population structure, not population collapse. This is the most formidable challenge. Stefan Schiffels at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology argued that what FitCoal detected might not be a true crash at all. Instead, the signal could reflect ancient population fragmentation across the African continent. Imagine 10,000 individuals split into dozens of isolated groups scattered across Africa. Each group rarely interbreeds with the others. Genetically, this fragmentation mimics a tiny population because genetic diversity between groups stops flowing. The coalescent signal looks identical. Schiffels and his colleagues demonstrated this through simulation. They built models where ancestral populations subdivided into semi-isolated demes, connected by occasional migration. The resulting genetic signatures were statistically indistinguishable from a single population of 1,280 individuals huddled in one location. This matters enormously. If the bottleneck was actually fragmentation, the story changes. No single catastrophe nearly wiped out our ancestors. Instead, geography and climate gradually partitioned a larger population into pockets. Each pocket survived independently. The drama becomes quieter, slower, less cinematic. But there is a problem with this objection. The FitCoal team anticipated it. They ran their own structure simulations and argued that genuine fragmentation produces subtly different patterns in the deep coalescent than a true bottleneck does. The mathematical signatures diverge at specific time depths. FitCoal, they claimed, can distinguish between them. Critics respond that FitCoal has never been independently validated at timescales this deep. 900,000 years pushes coalescent theory into territory where mutation rate uncertainty alone could swamp the signal. We are extrapolating from living genomes across geological time. The error bars are enormous. The honest answer is that neither side has definitively won this argument yet. The second competing theory involves multiple bottlenecks rather than one. Some geneticists propose that what FitCoal detected is actually the composite shadow of several smaller population crashes stacked across the Mid-Pleistocene. Each crash was less severe than 1,280 individuals, but their combined genetic effect mimics a single prolonged catastrophe. This theory draws support from paleoclimate data. The period between 900,000 and 700,000 years ago was not uniformly catastrophic. Ice cores and ocean sediment records show pulses of severe glaciation interspersed with milder intervals. Africa experienced corresponding oscillations in rainfall, vegetation, and habitable territory. Under this model, ancestral populations crashed during each glacial pulse, partially recovered during interglacials, then crashed again. The repeated hammering produced cumulative genetic erosion that FitCoal interprets as one long bottleneck lasting 117,000 years. This theory is elegant because it removes the need for a single mysterious cause. No supervolcano or pandemic needs to explain a sudden collapse. Instead, ordinary climate variability acting repeatedly on a vulnerable species gradually stripped away genetic diversity generation after generation. The effect accumulated like compound interest running in reverse. But this model also has weaknesses. If populations partially recovered between crashes, we would expect to see specific patterns of genetic rebound in the coalescent. FitCoal's analysis shows a remarkably flat population curve during the bottleneck period. No significant recovery pulses appear for 117,000 years. Either the repeated crashes were so closely spaced the recovery never gained traction, or the bottleneck was genuinely sustained. The data currently favors sustained collapse, but the resolution of our analytical tools may simply be too coarse to detect brief recoveries at this time depth. The third competing theory is the most radical. Perhaps the bottleneck is real, but affects only one lineage. Some researchers suggest that 1,280 individuals were not the ancestors of all modern humans. They may represent just one branch of a diverse hominin family tree. Other branches survived a period with larger populations, but eventually went extinct or were absorbed. The bottleneck shaped our lineage specifically. This theory aligns with growing evidence that the Mid-Pleistocene hosted multiple hominin species across Africa. Homo naledi persisted in southern Africa. Various Homo heidelbergensis populations occupied different ecological niches. The ancestor that became Homo sapiens may have been just one small tribe among many. Under this model, the bottleneck was real and severe, but it was local and lineage-specific. Our ancestors nearly vanished while cousin species thrived. The survival of our particular line was not humanity's close call. It was one species' close call, and that species happened to eventually win. This theory is haunting because it implies our existence was even more contingent than the original paper suggested. We were not the chosen survivors of a universal catastrophe. We were the lucky remnant of a minor lineage that almost disappeared unnoticed. Everything that followed, every civilization, every symphony, every act of love or cruelty, descends from a population that the planet barely noticed losing. Each of these three theories is supported by credible scientists using rigorous methods. Each changes the meaning of the bottleneck without necessarily denying its genetic signature. The data permits multiple interpretations. This is not a weakness of science. This is science working exactly as it should. But here is what all three theories share. Every single one acknowledges that something extraordinary happened to our ancestors during this period. Whether it was collapse or fragmentation, or repeated hammering, or lineage-specific crisis, the genetic evidence is unanimous on one point. We emerged from that period profoundly changed. The question is not whether transformation occurred. The question is what drove it. And for that, we need to look at evidence that did not exist when the original paper was published. Chapter 9. The evidence that changed everything in the months following the 2023 publication. Something unexpected happened. Researchers in adjacent fields began finding corroborating evidence in places no one had thought to look. The bottleneck paper had made a prediction, and the prediction was starting to come true. The prediction was this: if 1,280 individuals survived for 117,000 years, the archaeological record from that period should be almost empty, not sparse, not thin, functionally silent. And it is. A 2024 review of African archaeological sites published in the Journal of Human Evolution confirmed a dramatic reduction in datable sites between 900,000 and 600,000 years ago. The gap had been noticed before, but attributed to preservation bias, erosion, and taphonomic accident. Now the bottleneck hypothesis offered a simpler explanation. There were fewer sites because there were fewer people. Perhaps drastically fewer. The fossil silence was not an artifact of geology. It was the sound of a species barely existing. But the paradoxes began accumulating immediately. Paradox 1. The survivors should have been devastated by inbreeding depression, yet they clearly were not. Modern populations descended from severe bottlenecks, island species, and endangered animals typically show catastrophic loss of fitness. Genetic load accumulates. Harmful mutations become fixed. Fertility declines. Immune systems weaken. The 1,280 ancestors survived for 5,000 generations at bottleneck levels. The mathematical models predict they should have accumulated lethal genetic load sufficient to drive extinction. They should not have recovered. They should have spiraled into what geneticists call a mutational meltdown. They did not. Something purged the harmful mutations. Something maintained enough genetic health to permit explosive recovery when conditions improved. The leading hypothesis involves extremely intense purifying selection, meaning that individuals carrying dangerous mutations simply died before reproducing. every single generation for thousands of generations. This implies a brutal selective regime, not gentle natural selection, not gradual adaptation. A relentless generation after generation culling where the margin between survival and death was razor thin. Every birth was a genetic trial. Every childhood was a filter. Paradox 2. The chromosomal fusion should have caused reproductive isolation, yet it did not prevent population recovery. When two chromosomes fuse into one, carriers with the fused chromosome can still breed with non-carriers, but their offspring often have reduced fertility. For the fusion to spread through the entire population, either it conferred a strong selective advantage, or the population was so small that genetic drift alone could fix it. The bottleneck provides exactly those conditions. 1,280 individuals is a population where drift dominates. A neutral or even slightly disadvantageous chromosomal rearrangement could become universal in a population that's small within a few hundred generations. The bottleneck did not just permit the chromosome 2 fusion. It may have been the only circumstance under which such a fusion could have succeeded. This is a genuinely new insight. Before the bottleneck paper, the chromosome 2 fusion was a curiosity requiring special explanation. After the paper, it becomes an expected consequence. The bottleneck predicts the fusion rather than merely accommodating it. Paradox 3 involves brain development genes, and this is where the story becomes extraordinary. In 2024, a comparative genomic study identified a cluster of genes that underwent accelerated evolution precisely during the estimated bottleneck period. These genes are disproportionately involved in 3 functions: cerebral cortex expansion, synaptic plasticity, and social cognition. The researchers use molecular clock analysis to date the selective sweeps affecting these genes. The dates converge on the window between 900,000 and 700,000 years ago. The statistical probability of this convergence occurring by chance is less than 1 in 10,000. Something was selecting powerfully for enhanced brain function during the bottleneck. This finding creates a paradox because large brains are metabolically expensive. A starving population clinging to survival should not be investing biological resources in bigger, hungrier brains. Caloric scarcity should select for metabolic efficiency, for smaller bodies, for reduced energy expenditure. Instead, the opposite happened. Brains grew larger. Neural connections became more complex. The architecture of social cognition became more elaborate. The survivors paid an enormous metabolic price for cognitive enhancement at precisely the moment when calories were scarcest. Unless the cognitive enhancement was itself the survival strategy. This is the key insight that reframes everything. The brain did not expand despite the crisis. The brain expanded because of the crisis. Enhanced cognition was not a luxury. It was the mechanism of survival. The survivors who thought better, planned further, communicated more effectively, and cooperated more deeply were the ones who lived. New archaeological evidence supports this interpretation cautiously. Sites dating to the recovery period, roughly 700,000 to 500,000 years ago, show a sudden leap in technological sophistication. At Kathupan in South Africa, stone-tipped spears appear by 500,000 years ago. At Lorgeseli in Kenya, the transition from crude Acheulean hand axes to refined Middle Stone Age tools accelerates dramatically. These innovations require planning, abstraction, and social coordination far beyond what earlier hominins demonstrated. They require what cognitive scientists call mental time travel, the ability to imagine future scenarios and prepare for them. They require teaching, which demands theory of mind. The bottleneck survivors' descendants did not just make better tools. They thought in fundamentally new ways. A 2024 study of ancient protein residues on stone tools from this transitional period found evidence of composite adhesives, glues made by combining plant resins with mineral additives. Creating such adhesives requires understanding chemistry intuitively holding multi-step procedures in working memory and transmitting recipes across generations. This is not instinct. This is culture. And culture requires a brain capable of symbolic thought, of holding abstract representations, of communicating complex ideas through structured signals that may or may not yet have been language as we understand it. The paradox resolves into a single stunning possibility. The bottleneck did not merely test our ancestors. It selected specifically for the cognitive traits that make us human. The 1,280 survivors lived or died based on their ability to think, cooperate, and innovate under extreme pressure. Every generation that passed through that filter was slightly smarter, slightly more socially attuned, slightly better at planning and communicating than the one before. Over 5,000 generations, the cumulative effect was transformative. The bottleneck was not a catastrophe that our ancestors survived despite being human. It was the catastrophe that made them human. But this raises the deepest question of all, the one we have been building toward since the beginning. If the bottleneck forged human cognition, if crisis itself was the crucible, then what exactly did those 1,280 individuals learn to do that no hominin had ever done before? The answer has been hiding in the genetics all along, and it is not what anyone expected. Chapter 10. What the survivors learned. For 9 chapters, we have circled this moment. We have traced the evidence through genetics, paleoclimate, archaeology, and comparative genomics. We have weighed competing theories honestly. We have followed paradoxes to their logical conclusions. Now the threads converge. The 1,280 survivors learned to do something no hominin had ever done before. They learned to survive through each other. That sentence sounds simple. It is not. To understand why it constitutes a revolution in the history of life on Earth, we need to appreciate what cooperation meant before the bottleneck and what it became after. Before the bottleneck, hominin cooperation was immediate and situational. Groups of Homo erectus and early Homo heidelbergensis hunted together, shared food within family units, and maintained social hierarchies similar to those observed in other great apes. This cooperation was powerful but limited. It was limited because it depended on direct reciprocity. I help you because you help me. I share food with you because you are my kin. I tolerate you in my group because your presence benefits me right now. Every cooperative act required an immediate or near-term payoff. This kind of cooperation cannot sustain a population of 1,280 through 117,000 years of crisis. The mathematics are unforgiving. A population that's small, spread across even a reduced habitable range, cannot maintain the encounter rates necessary for direct reciprocity to function. Groups become too small. Individuals interact with the same few people for entire lifetimes. Genetic diversity collapses without intergroup mating. For the population to survive, groups that had never met had to cooperate. Individuals had to trust strangers. Resources had to flow between bands separated by days of travel. Mating networks had to extend far beyond the local group to prevent inbreeding collapse. This requires a fundamentally different cognitive architecture. It requires the ability to recognize someone you have never met as a member of your kind. It requires symbolic markers of identity, ways of signaling shared membership that transcend personal familiarity. It requires agreements that persist beyond a single encounter. It requires, in short, the foundations of what we call culture. The genetic evidence now points to exactly this transition. The genes under strongest selection during the bottleneck period are not primarily those controlling brain size. Those size increased. They are genes controlling 3 specific capacities. First, enhanced working memory. The ability to hold multiple social relationships, obligations, and identities in mind simultaneously. To remember who owes what to whom, who is related to whom, which distant group can be trusted, and which cannot. Second, advanced theory of mind. The ability to model the mental states of others, to predict behavior, to understand that another individual has knowledge, desires, and intentions different from your own. This capacity enables deception, but more importantly, it enables deep empathy and coordinated planning. Third, proto-linguistic neural architecture. Not language itself, not yet, but the neural substrate that makes structured symbolic communication possible. Enhanced connectivity between Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Expanded prefrontal cortex. Refined motor control of the tongue, lips, and larynx. These three capacities together constitute what anthropologists call the social brain. And the social brain is not an adaptation for hunting or tool-making or navigating landscapes. It is an adaptation for navigating other people. The bottleneck selected for social intelligence because social intelligence was the only thing that could save the species. Consider the survival mathematics. 1,280 breeding individuals need a minimum viable network to avoid inbreeding depression. Geneticists estimate that approximately 50 genetically distinct lineages must persist and intermix to maintain population health across thousands of generations. Maintaining 50 distinct lineages in a population of 1,280 requires structured exchange. It requires bands deliberately sending individuals to other bands for mating. It requires systems for tracking kinship across groups. It requires something resembling marriage rules, alliance networks, and intergroup obligation. No other animal on Earth does this at this level of complexity. Chimpanzees transfer females between groups, but the process is opportunistic, not structured. No great ape maintains alliance networks spanning multiple groups that have never directly interacted. No great ape tracks kinship obligations across 3 or more generations. The bottleneck survivors had to invent these systems or die. And they invented them using the only tool available, their expanding social brains. This is why the brain grew larger during caloric scarcity. The metabolic cost of a bigger brain was enormous, but the cost of social failure was extinction. Individuals who could maintain larger social networks, remember more relationships, communicate more effectively, and cooperate with strangers had more surviving offspring. The selection pressure was not gradual. It was immediate and absolute. Every generation, for 5,000 generations. This explains the coordinated genetic changes that baffled researchers. Brain development genes, immune function genes, and social cognition genes all shifted simultaneously because they were all part of the same survival strategy. Enhanced immunity kept individuals alive long enough to build social networks. Enhanced cognition made the networks functional. It also explains the explosive recovery. When conditions finally improved around 813,000 years ago, the survivors did not simply expand into empty territory the way a normal animal population recovers after a crash. They expanded with a new cognitive toolkit. They could form alliances with distant groups. They could organize collective hunts across larger territories. They could transmit technological knowledge across generations through teaching rather than mere imitation. They could plan for seasons they had never experienced by listening to elders who had. The recovery was explosive because the survivors were no longer the same kind of animal that had entered the bottleneck. They had become cultural beings. This is the revelation the evidence demands. The bottleneck did not merely reduce our ancestors to 1,280 desperate individuals clinging to survival in a hostile world. It forced those individuals to develop the cognitive and social capacities that define our species. Every human institution traces back to this moment. Language, kinship systems, trade networks, moral codes, religious traditions, political alliances. All of them are elaborations of the survival strategy invented by 1,280 people who had no choice but to transcend the limitations of every primate that had come before. The cave paintings at Lascaux, created 800,000 years later, are the distant echo of this revolution. Those painted animals are proof that human minds can hold symbols, share meaning, and project consciousness across time. That capacity was born in the bottleneck. You are the descendant of people who learned to trust strangers. You carry in your genome the architecture of cooperation forged under conditions of near extinction. Your ability to read these words, to follow this argument, to feel something about ancestors you will never meet, exists because 1,280 individuals discovered that survival requires community. They could not have known what they were building. They could not have imagined that their desperate social innovations would eventually produce civilizations spanning continents. They were simply trying to survive the next season, the next drought, the next generation. But in trying to survive, they became us. The vanishing made us what we are, not despite the crisis, because of it. This is the deepest lesson of the bottleneck. Humanity was not born from triumph. It was born from catastrophe. Our greatest capacities, love, language, cooperation, imagination, are not gifts bestowed by a generous universe. They are scars left by a brutal one. And they are the most beautiful scars in the history of life on Earth. So here we stand, 900,000 years downstream from the vanishing. 7 billion descendants of 1,280. Every city on Earth is a monument to their survival. Every conversation is an echo of their first desperate attempts to reach across the distance between one mind and another. But one question remains unanswered, and it may be the most important question of all. Could it happen again? Not the bottleneck itself. Modern humans number 8 billion. No plausible natural catastrophe could reduce us to 1,200. But the conditions that made the bottleneck transformative, extreme pressure forcing radical cognitive and social adaptation, those conditions are not unique to the Pleistocene. We face our own Mid-Pleistocene transition now. Climate systems are shifting. Ecological networks are collapsing. The familiar patterns that sustain civilization are breaking down. We are not vanishing in numbers, but the stable world we evolved to navigate is vanishing around us. The bottleneck teaches us that crisis is not merely destructive, it is also creative. The same pressure that nearly ended our lineage also forged our greatest capacities. The question is whether we can access that creative response deliberately, consciously, without requiring catastrophe to force our hand. Our ancestors had no choice. We do. That is perhaps the only meaningful difference between their crisis and ours. They could not see what was happening to them. We can. They adapted blindly through the slow machinery of natural selection. We can choose. 900,000 years ago, 1,280 people saved the future by learning to see each other as essential. The genome remembers. The question is whether we do. If this story changed how you see yourself and the unlikely chain of survival that made you possible, you will like our next video on the Younger Dryas Comet Impact Mystery. Subscribe to our channel and share this with someone who needs to know how improbable and precious their existence truly is. The past is not finished speaking. We just have to keep listening.